Hey, it's AC and welcome to my house. Thanks for another. Well, thank you. I'm thanking you for an episode of House of AC because I'm doing this for you. So thank you for tuning in live and also listening later, whether it's on the YouTube page or Facebook. I appreciate it. Your likes and follows and subscribes and feedback also very well appreciated. Thank you. That keeps me going, keeps me guided, lets me know what you want to hear, what you like, what you don't like. Um, and I got thick skin. If you've got critical feedback for me, let's hear it. I'm okay with that. I want to make a good product for you. We have a fun episode today in that we learn the strategies of the super wealthy, what billionaires do, the top 1%, what they do with their money. And it might surprise a lot of you. This is a strategy that's popularized by a professor at University of Southern California, Ed McCaffrey, um, called Buy, Borrow, and Die. And so we're going to talk a little bit about death and the benefits of that when with using this strategy, and also the benefits of buying and borrowing. If you are a Dave Ramsey fan, this is not going to be something that is something you're used to hearing. If you're unfamiliar, Dave Ramsey's a personal finance talking head that is all about never borrowing, no debt, no credit cards. Try to avoid a mortgage, car notes. He's anti debt as you can get, and I think there's a purpose for that. If you're learning about finances, it's a good strategy to understand how to control your money. It's the only strategy really that I would recommend to get from negative net worth to zero net worth. But that's where it falls short, and that's why Dave Ramsey gets a lot of hate and negative feedback. Is that like, this his strategies are for not for rich people. Rich people are going to do the buy, borrow, and die strategy, which you're going to hear here, and it's 100% different than the Dave Ramsey strategy. And so whenever I say don't do what Dave Ramsey says, it's polarizing, because if all you know about finance is what you hear from him, then it just means that you're in a different stage of your life. I used to follow that advice. I used to give that advice. My book, $1,000,000 by 30, was very much similar advice. Live well below your means, diversify, try to pay off a little bit of debt, and or as much as debt as you can. But then once you get on your feet and you go from negative net worth to positive net worth, all those strategies are not going to help you grow your wealth. It'll preserve your wealth. And so, are you going to be in a growth mindset or a wealth preservation mindset? So, Dave Ramsey is all about wealth preservation. And as I got older and more comfortable, had more risk and had more assets, and I was no longer negative um, net worth, then obviously the growth mindset is fun and where to be at. So, just that disclaimer up front. This is not for the Dave Ramsey fans, but you should hear it. You should understand it. And maybe this could be a goal for you, or maybe this is something you can apply right away, the buy, borrow, and die strategy. So, headlines that you might have seen recently here and there. Mark Zuckerberg has a 1% mortgage rate on his house. And you might say, why was one of the richest people in the world get a mortgage? Well, because it goes along this buy, borrow, and die strategy. They definitely have he obviously definitely has the means to buy his house in cash, which would be the Dave Ramsey strategy, yet he doesn't do it. And I would suspect Dave Ramsey doesn't do it either. I know he has a $16 million listing in Nashville. I highly doubt that's in cash, because when you get to a certain level of wealth, I mean, Dave Ramsey's very wealthy. Leveraging your money and doing this strategy, which is 100% against his advice to his listeners, is how you afford those properties and afford more properties and amplify and accelerate your wealth. Let's see here. Larry Ellis of Oracle has a $28 billion credit line. He buys everything off of this credit line. He obviously has more money than that. I assume, if he has a credit line of 28 billion, and yet he's borrowing everything that comes with an interest rate, almost like a credit card. And Elon Musk has a $112 billion credit line, which he buys everything off of and probably starts companies off of and reinvests and buys more assets for the strategy. So rich people who could afford everything in all cash, yet they don't, because it's not in their best interest. So let's dig in. First, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Jasmine Mortgage Team. If you're looking to refi or purchase a new house, JasmineMortgageTeam.com is the place to go. I personally use Jasmine. I've got a shirt right here, Jasmine Mortgage Team. She's made me completely wealthy using this buy, borrow, and die strategy, whether she knew it or not. I didn't even know it at the time, honestly. I learned this strategy after the fact, but I knew I needed to borrow some money. Cash out refi some real estate investment properties so I can go buy other investments. So if you've got some real estate assets and you like the strategy, please reach out to JasmineMortgageTeam.com. Okay, so 3 parts: buy, borrow, and die. Buy is number one. Let's talk about that. So buy, this is buying an asset. We've talked about the difference between assets and liabilities. Typically, an asset is something of value, or not typically, it is something of value that makes you money. It is a cash flowing asset. That's the bread and butter. Real estate rental property, cash flowing asset. Maybe stocks that pay a dividend, or bonds, cash flowing assets. You could have a business, a franchise, part ownership of a startup or something, an asset that's increasing in value without maybe your day to day. You have a property manager manage your assets, so you're not involved every single day. You're making money in your sleep. Stock prices go up. You got a portfolio of stocks, things like this. These are all assets. Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, they're assets. And so that's the buy, right? Everyone gets that. You've got to buy as many assets as possible. Your house, your primary residence, your car that you have to drive for work, not an asset. It may have some value, may have to resell it, but it's costing you money each month as you sleep. You're paying mortgage every month. You're paying a car note every month, not making you money. However, if you put that property on, Airbnb or VRBO, and you're making money off of it, there. Now you turn that liability into an asset. If you put your car on Turo, make some money off of it, drive it around, and with a car wrap on it, advertising something that pays for, covers the car note. Okay, then that's an asset. But most things that you have are probably liabilities, things that are costing you money. Other assets can be like Lamborghinis, Rolexes, things like that. If they're paid off mostly, then they're assets. If they're completely paid off, because then you could sell them. They're not costing you money each day, and then you could possibly get collateralized loans against them. Which brings me to step 2, the borrow strategy. So with these assets, this is what the super wealthy do. This is what the billionaires do. Very familiar. They never sell anything. Let me share my screen here. And if you're tuning into the podcast, I'll do my best to explain what's on the screen. Here we go. We're going to look at this graph real quick. And my phone's ringing. I did not turn off my phone. So, sorry about that. Okay. Let's see here. Let me put that on airplane mode. Okay, we're back in business. Okay. My screen, kind of hard to read. All right, so these are where I got some of those stats that I started the episode from. What owners of companies do, that are public companies, is they own a lot of stock. The CEOs, the founders, major investors of a lot of these big companies own a lot of stock. So for instance, Elon Musk has his net worth is 318 billion when this article in Forbes was written in November 2021, about 6 months ago. So these rich people do something called pledging their shares. So Elon Musk has, 36% of his shares pledged. Larry of Tesla. Larry Ellison of Oracle has 27% of his shares pledged. And what that means is basically he owns these shares. Elon or Larry, these are the 2 biggest ones. We'll start there. They own the shares. If they sell these shares because they want money, well, then they got to pay capital gains taxes on it. And in their tax bracket, there's probably 25 to 30%. So if they sell $100 million, then they're going to have to pay 30 million in taxes. Not the best use of their money. But they could pledge their shares, which basically means I am going to allow someone to be a gatekeeper on them. I still own them, but I want to borrow against them. So if I want to pledge $1 million of Tesla shares, and I'm Elon Musk, a bank will say, gladly, we'll hold these Tesla shares that you're pledging to us that are worth $100 million today, or in this case, it goes up to $112 billion. And then you can borrow, and we'll give you a loan that you can borrow money against. And because we think that you're good for it, we'll give you a super low interest rate. It can be as low as 0.5%, less than 1%. Because this bank who's doing this is saying, hey, we're okay making a really small margin because the dollar size is so big that this is great. Two, it's collateralized with Tesla stock. So it's not 1-to-1. So basically he would have to pledge, let's say, $200 billion of Tesla shares, but they'll allow him to borrow $100 billion in cash. That's just an example, 50% of it. So it's not 1-to-1. And the lending company is saying, hey, I know the Tesla stock may go up and down. It might be a little volatile, but give us double than what you want to borrow. That's a little high. Usually they'll let him borrow 70% of the stock portfolio that he's pledging. And so there's some wiggle room, and so he gets to borrow very, very, very cheap money, less than 1%, which he can go do something with, right? He can go reinvest it in other companies and stocks and real estate. He could just pay for his lifestyle, and he saved $30 million doing that, because otherwise, if he sold it, his net worth would go down because he sold some of his assets. Then he paid taxes on those assets. So his net worth goes down even more. But if you never sell any of your assets and you constantly borrow against it with really, really cheap money, well, then you can buy more assets. And guess what? Those assets will probably go up in value. And then you get to borrow against those assets. And it's just this cycle of borrowing against ever increasing assets. You just never sell anything. And of course, when you sell something, you pay taxes. If you don't sell something, you don't pay taxes. So this is how the super rich avoid paying taxes, because they're living off borrowed money, right? And that borrowed money is making them more money because they're reinvesting it constantly and never selling anything. So that's the borrowing strategy here. Looking back at my screen, Jim Walton of Walmart, these are just shares in the company that they're pledging. So also consider these rich guys also, and gals, also have real estate that they're pledging against, other stocks that they own that they can pledge against. They've got cryptocurrency that they can pledge against. Probably their fancy cars that are paid off in cash they can be pledged against and use as collateral. Jim Walton's got just Walmart shares of 629 million pledged. Steven Schwartzman of Blackstone, $699 million pledged. George Kaiser of BOK Financial Corporation, 2.3 billion. These numbers are crazy, right? Monster Beverage Corp, Rodney Sachs has 20 million pledged. He's the poor guy on this list. So it's insane. And it's really interesting strategy. So definitely understanding this will help you. And also help avoid pay taxes. So let me share another thing that I made, this spreadsheet here that we can walk through, maybe a more reasonable scenario, still a privileged scenario, but let me zoom in here so that you can read it. All right. So let's just say, for instance, this made up person I have on here, and has $200,000 in stocks, non-retirement. I quickly looked online for how to lend. Okay, so here's the thing. If you've got just stocks, say you only have money in your stock portfolio, you can get a portfolio loan against these stocks. They've got several names for it: PAL loan, pledged asset loan, portfolio loan, margin loan, securities backed loan. If you Google any of these words, you'll see a bunch of different products, a bunch of different companies offering them. I just took a snapshot here. I'm not affiliated with any of them. I don't have experience with them, so I'm not going to give you any names. But enter in pledged asset loan, portfolio loan, margin loan, securities-backed loan, stock portfolio loan, any of those sort of words in Google, and you'll have a dozen choices, and they all provide different products that will and different interest rates. Most of them start at around $100,000. $50,000 on a few of them is the minimum balance you would need, but you typically get the best rates once you hit sort of the $200,000 range. But these products are always changing all the time. So let's assume you have stocks, a bunch of stocks. It cannot be retirement stocks. So you can't get any of these portfolio loans if you've got an IRA or Roth IRA or traditional IRA. None of the retirement loans can be used as collateral. So this would be stocks that you have or ETF that you have in like a brokerage account. Let's assume you have $200,000. I saw the products searching loan to value, which basically means they'll give you 30% up to 85% loan on the value of those stocks. The lowest interest rate I saw was 6.5% at this price point, and it went up to 3.5%. So that's really cheap money. 6.5% to 3.5%, and assuming you borrow up to 85% of it, I mean, what do I have here? 70%. If we only borrowed 70% of 200,000, even though some of the loan products went up to 85%, if we borrowed 70% of the $200,000 at, roughly a 2% interest rate, you've got 2 to 3% interest rate. You've got $140,000 available to reinvest, and that monthly cost is going to be about $650. So let's take that. Let's take that $140,000 that we're borrowing less than 3%. And if I put in this investment calculator, $140,000, rate of return 7%. Now that stock market on average returns about 8%. Really, it returns about 11%, but inflation adjustment, it comes down to about 7 to 8%, mostly 8%. Historically, so if you're in the long haul, you're not day trading, you just put in the market 10, 20 years, you're going to earn 7 to 8% on your money. So if you do this strategy, you take the stocks portfolio that you have, that $200,000 in this situation, pull it out, borrow against 75% of it. So you have $140,000, you're borrowing at 3%, and you're reinvesting it back in the stock market. You get a rate of return of 7%. This calculator says you're going to have roughly $275,000, which is basically doubling your 140, right? 140 doubled is 280, and this is telling us we're going to have in 10 years $275,000. That's just a 10-year investment. So of course, you start this train, you've doubled your net worth because by borrowing against what you have, and guess what happens in 10 years? Well, you borrow against this 275, pull out another 140, 150, and then you put it back in the stock market and you reinvest at 7, hopefully you get 7% or more. And it's just a cycle of pulling money out, borrowing non-taxable event. If you borrow and pull out $270,000, you're not paying taxes. So if you had that at a day job, 50% of that goes to the government. And here it's basically having a $550,000 job, pulling this out tax free. So that's a great way to avoid taxes and get wealthier, right? You keep getting richer and richer and richer. Just keep reinvesting it. Going back to this spreadsheet, real estate equity is maybe something you're familiar with. Think of it when you get a mortgage, a company's willing to give you money for a mortgage because they have a collateral, they have an asset that says, you know what, if you forfeit, this house is worth more than the money I'm giving you. You may have to put, there's loan programs, FHA, that's 3.5% down. And the bank says, well, we're going to send an appraiser out there, make sure that we know what it's worth. We'll lend you 96.5% of that because we don't think you're going to default on your house. If you got to make payments, you're going to stay there. But if you do default and you just don't make payments, we know what this house is worth and we're willing to sell it and get our money back. And in between, based on your credit score and all that, your interest rate will determine, the risk profile that the bank has for you. But You can do that with your real estate equity. So what that equity is the what the house is worth minus what you owe. So maybe in your primary residence, you've lived there 2 years, and the real estate market's taken off, and now it's worth an extra $50,000. Maybe you fixed up the house and improved it. You put some $10,000 into a kitchen, added in a spare bedroom, something like that, and you've increased $50,000 of the house, and with through sweat equity. Somehow you've increased the worth of this home, one that you live in, or maybe an investment property. $50,000. You now have extra $50,000 of equity. There's products out there called a home equity line of credit. And what that is basically saying, well, we know you got this equity in here. We'll give you 75% of that equity. And 75% of that is, say, $35,000, but I'm terrible at math in my head. So let me see what this is worth. 50 times that, my calculator. Yeah, $37,500. So you might as well pull out $37,500, because the home equity line is either A, interest only, or two, it'll probably go up to 3.5%, 5%. Pull out that $35,000, because that's cheap money. You could either go put it in the stock market, earn 7 or 8, or you can go put it as a down payment on another house. Go put it on a down payment on some crypto that you think is going to go up in value. It basically, you're giving yourself more money to reinvest, and those reinvestments are going to pay off, hopefully over time. And then you borrow from those assets, and then you rinse and repeat. You're constantly pulling the money out and you're reinvesting. And what I know, a lot of people right here are freaking out. They're scared. Oh, what about the market downturn and everything? So let's talk about that. That is the number one risk in this situation, is what happens if the market tanks, right? First, there's two ways to look at it. As someone who might be applying this strategy, let's say your stock portfolio, that first example where you pulled out $140,000. If the world doesn't crash in 10 years, you've already taken that $140,000 and turned it into $275,000, right? And let's say you take that $275,000 and put it in another investment. Well, if that first investment tanks because you've borrowed against it and you slowly are just paying the interest only note on it, you don't lose any money, because you had 140 in there, and if it goes to zero, who cares? In this scenario, who cares? Because you've already pulled out 140 out of it. That 200, you pulled out 140, reinvested, and made 275, right? So if that first investment fails for whatever reason, you've already got more than your money out of it, and you've reinvested it somewhere else. So if you're super conservative and you never borrow against it, and that goes to zero, you lost all your money. But if you borrow against it, reinvest it somewhere else, well, now you've got one that will prop up the other. And so the same thing could happen. Maybe you pull out $140,000 and put that in investment B, and investment B tanks. Well, who cares? Because you still own investment A that'll be making up a lot of money, right, for you. And so you're spreading out risk this way by diversifying. Maybe you take some out of the stock market, put it in real estate. Maybe you take some out of the real estate, put it in the stock market. Maybe you take some out of both and put it in the crypto. Maybe you take it out of all three and go buy another sort of asset that cash flows. It's all about spreading risk and not using your own money. So when Mark Zuckerberg buys a $30 million house, Drake buys a $30 million house, they're not buying it in cash. They're borrowing against it 1% interest rate, cheaper than a mortgage, because it's in their best interest. They don't have to pay taxes on accessing that money, and then they can re-leverage it, and so it goes somewhere else. Very, very cheap debt. This is the way to do it. This is the borrow strategy. Now let's talk about when you get to the die strategy, right? So when you die, and this is also a rich people move, right? Because there's their children, their heirs, they're going to inherit a fortune. And what are they going to do? And how do I protect them? And, all those sorts of thoughts are going through their minds. Well, when you buy a house, let's say, or stock or any asset, there's something called a basis. This is what you bought it for and what you put into it to improve the value. We'll do real estate as an example here. Um, if you bought real estate for $1 million and it was cash flowing, it was a rental, and when you died, it was worth $3 million. This is what happens to your heirs. You could say, "Oh, I'm on my deathbed. Let me go sell this $3 million asset." And you bought it for a million. Maybe you put $500,000 into it. So your basis is $1.5 million. And so you could, on your deathbed, sell that property for $3 million, and they will say, "Great, you made $1.5 million profit here because your basis is 1.5, $1 million purchase price, $500,000 in renovations over your ownership, and you sold it for $3 million. That's 1.5 profit, 1.5 million profit, and you're going to have to pay taxes 25-30% on that because you're a rich person, 30% tax bracket, and that can be pretty painful. However, if you say, "I don't want to sell that and I keep borrowing against it over that lifespan, 10 years, 20 years," you probably pulled out more than $1.5 million of equity out of that building. Well, let's see. Let's say you pulled out $1 million, right? You probably bought that property for $1 million. You put $250,000 down to buy it, and you probably pulled out $1 million during cash out refis over time as that property went up in value all the way up to $3.5 million. But here's what happens. If you die and what happens, your heirs then inherit that property at its current value. And they say, "Well, you didn't buy this property at $1 million. The dead rich dude bought it at $1 million. You, the child of the dead rich dude, inherited this property when it was worth $3 million. So now your basis is $3 million. So if you go and sell this property for $3 million, well, you don't own any taxes because you got it, inherited it at $3 million, and you sold it at $3 million. You pay no taxes. So this is the die part of the buy, borrow, and die strategy. It's a great way to avoid taxes. So every super wealthy person out there borrows as much as possible, reinvest that debt to leverage into other investments. And then as these investments take off, they borrow more money out, borrow. And then when they die, their heirs don't have to pay taxes on it because they get a step-up basis called a step-up basis, because when they inherited it, it's now at a higher value. But if they sold it while they were alive, then they would have to pay taxes on it. There is a strategy also called a 1031 exchange. And this is you don't have to be super rich to use this. And this is if you sell real estate, it only applies to real estate. And it's for that. You'd only want to use really a 1031 if you want your kids to inherit real estate one day. For the same reason, you avoid taxes. But let me give you an example. You buy a rental house for $100,000 and you sold it for $200,000. You could just cash out, get your taxes, pay 20-30% on those taxes, and you have $70,000 cash in the story. Or if you sold an investment property for $200,000, you could do a 1031 exchange as long as you bought another property worth $200,000 or more. So you could take your $100,000. It's now worth $200,000. You've got $100,000 of equity in there. That's a 25% down payment on a $400,000 property. So now you can basically swap 1031 exchange that for a $400,000 property, and you just snowball it up. And then when that $400,000 property is worth $500,000, you've just got another $100K of equity. Now you've got, $200K of equity. You can flip that 1031 that into an $800,000 property. So this is a way you can kind of snowball and get bigger and bigger properties without paying taxes. However, let's say it gets to $1 million and you're old and you're retired and you're like, "All right, I'm ready to sell it." That $1 million property is sold. The IRS is going to say, "Wait a minute, we got to follow the snowball all the way down to the original purchase." So you're selling $1 million property, but it all started with a $100,000 property. So that's $900,000 gain right there, more or less, that you get taxed on. That's a big bill. So you never want to sell a property that you've 1031'd. What you want to do is wait and just borrow against it, cash out refi, keep snowballing bigger and bigger properties. And then when you die, your heirs are going to inherit $1 million property and all that snowball melted away of debt, and you don't owe any taxes on it. So that's the dying part. it's just a great strategy. You could use it. Like I said, if I go back, let's go back to the spreadsheet I've made of sort of assets that possibly you could qualify for. Um, Real estate equity, like I said, as long as you probably $50,000 or more, you can get a HELOC, home equity line of credit, or you can do a cash out refi on any property. Typically, they'll lend against 75% of the equity in your real estate. Interest rates as low as 2.5% to 5%, depending on the property and your wealth. And so crypto, sort of thing. Typically, I think the lowest I also saw was $50,000, but you kind of get the best rates around $100,000, $200,000. They'll lend on 30 to 70% of your crypto portfolio. These rates are a little bit higher because there's a little bit more volatility, 3.5% to 7% interest rate. And so in this example, if someone has $200,000 in stocks, non-retirement stocks, $200,000 real estate equity, $200,000 in crypto portfolio, they might be saying, well, I'm saving up for a down payment on a house. I've got these $600,000 of assets that I could sell them all, or I could sell some of them to go buy, to use as a down payment on a new primary. This is the poor way to think, even though you have 600,000. The rich way to think would be, okay, let's take a portfolio loan against that. And based on the math and the options, you can pull out $430,000 out of that $600,000, and that would be tax-free. Your monthly cost would probably be about $2,250. And you could probably take that $430,000, use that as your down payment for a house, or find a way to turn that $430,000 to make you more than $2,250 a month, which I imagine you could do. You're probably thinking, well, I'm going to take that and pay off my other debts. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. That's the Dave Ramsey method, right? You want to pay, maybe if you have liabilities, sure. But you could go buy a Lamborghini with that. And then there's products out there that will lend against your Lamborghini. And just like a home equity line lends against your house equity, the equity in your Lamborghini. You would just want to make sure your Lamborghini doesn't get a bunch of miles on it and decrease in value. But you have options here, right? You're buying an asset, and then let's borrow against that asset. And whatever we borrow, pull out, we buy another asset. You spread out all these investments, this stock and that stock, this commercial real estate, this residential real estate, Bitcoin, Ethereum. You've spread. You have so many eggs and so many baskets. If one of them fails, which will probably happen, maybe 10% of your investments fail. Actually, let me say it this way. Maybe 80% of your investments fail. I doubt that'll happen, because if you're this wealthy, you probably understand markets and know what you're doing. But let's assume 80% of those markets fail and you go down in value. Chances are those 20% are going to carry the weight of those 80 losers, right? The 20% winners are going to be huge winners. They're going to be unicorns. They're going to hockey stick skyrocket straight up. And that'll make up for all your other losers. But you could reinvest all that money in the safest investments possible, bonds, right? Mutual funds, things like that. And you're just going to get wealthier and wealthier, and then you borrow against that and reinvest. So this is the buy, borrow, and die strategy, which is very interesting. And you just take whatever money out, reinvest in the stock market, 7%. You'll double your money in 10 years. Let's see what else. Anything I did not cover along here, but this goes against the Dave Ramsey advice. Pay off all your debts. Oh yeah, let's talk about like companies. Apple, like every company, Amazon, Apple, every tech startup that you believe in, that you probably use their services every single day. I mean, they made it off borrowed money. And a lot of these billionaires go start other companies, and then they borrow other, they still go to other investors so they can all spread out their wealth. And that's why when people say there's so much capital out there, this is what they mean. If you find a good deal in real estate, you can usually find a good partner, because the super rich people are always looking for new investments. How can I borrow against what I have to go spread my risk around and try different investments? So if you find a good deal, which basically means hey, I find this property that I could rent for X amount of dollars or flip or renovate. And I need X amount of dollars, and I think I'll turn it into Y amount of dollars in 2 years. And I don't have the money. It's talking to people, talking to investors, joining real estate investment groups, things like that, because people need to deploy this capital. Otherwise, they just cash out, get the loan on this, and they're just paying interest on it. But they need to deploy it. They need to reinvest it. So borrowing money is cheap for these companies. And then so what Apple does is when they have this huge cash reserves, they have massive cash reserves. They're one of the companies, they have like billions of dollars in cash. That's because that cash is sitting in international accounts. If they move that cash over to the US accounts, they got to pay taxes on it. And they don't want to do that. So what does Apple do? Well, they leave the cash internationally and then they borrow against that cash. And then they take that cash and a lot of times they'll buy their own stock back. Because if there's fewer stock out there, if Apple stock that people can buy, well, that is a lower supply and that makes the value go up. So instead of using their cash to, pay for more market research, hire more employees, they borrow against that. And then they'll buy their own stock, which increases the value of the stock because there's fewer stocks to buy, and they make themselves richer. And then from that, then they can, even with that borrowed money, go hire, better employees and research and development and all that. So even companies are doing this. It's not just an individual approach. Companies are constantly wanting to borrow money against their reserves rather than actually spend the reserves because that avoids them on taxes. That's the buy, borrow, and die strategy. Very popular. Everyone does it. I've done deals with super wealthy people who could buy the house in cash, and they don't do it because they're doing the strategy. It's just understanding debt and being comfortable with debt and understanding there's two types of debt. Credit card debt. That's the worst debt. That's always pay that off because it's not an asset, right? Car note debt, student loan debt. That's tough for me because the interest rate's so low. It's cheap money. So what I would recommend is, depending on what your interest rate is, and there's now new programs. If you've applied to erase your debt because you're in part of those programs, where if you work in a certain industry for 10 years, they've now kind of finally got that off the rails. So go reapply. Constantly on my Facebook page in the past month, I've seen 3 or 4 people talking about how it finally works. So there are loan forgiveness programs actually working now. So if you're listening to this and this is your situation and you're one of those industries, just reapply again. Because they finally worked out that mess. But otherwise, let's say you're this is my house fire example. Everything comes back to real estate. That's where I got my bread and butter. But let's say you got a $30,000 student loan debt. Probably you got a low interest rate, and let's say your payments are $400 a month. I would find a way to take that $30,000. Let's go buy a property instead. So you're keeping the asset. And that asset makes you $400. And then you fast forward 20 years, that $400 eventually pays off your student loan. And you still have a house that's probably been paid off by tenants. You got to keep your money that way. Look at it this way from the mind of the person giving money as well. These banks want as many reserves as possible. So if they're going to lend you on your portfolio, and then you got to keep your portfolio, buy your stocks through their program, or keep your cash assets in that bank, and they'll give you credit lines all day. So maybe you're not aware of this, but you can definitely get credit lines, $50,000 on up. Again, you're going to get the best rates, $100,000, $200,000 more. Look into getting these credit lines. Again, they're called pledged asset loan. That's if you own stock in a company. Portfolio loan, margin loan, securities backed loan, stock portfolio loans. Usually the more money you have in there, the better rates you get. That makes sense. They want you to keep your money because if you sell those assets, then they don't have as much money to borrow, on their reserves. So they want you. You're incentivized to borrow against it from the lender's aspect, but also as a borrower's aspect, you're going to leverage your money, and great things are going to happen. Well, thanks, guys. If you like and subscribe this, follow me along at the House of AC. Go to Linktree/the House of AC. There's actually a crypto backed mortgage that is coming in America. I know there's one in Canada. So in my Linktree / the House of AC, you can get on a wait list for a crypto backed mortgage. What that means is, and how this works is, let's assume you've got $500,000 of Bitcoin. Well, you might say, I believe in Bitcoin. I think this is going to go up in value. I think this a Bitcoin, my $500,000 portfolio in 2022 may be $5 million in 2032. Whatever you got or whatever you believe that's going to go up. So you don't want to sell it. So Milo, which again, a link in my Linktree / the House of AC, I got a referral link that will help us get on the wait list. If this is interesting to you, is basically he's going to say, okay, keep your $500,000 crypto, a Bitcoin, put it in our wallet. We're going to manage it. We're going to hold it. It's going to be safe. And it's going to be volatile. So we're going to say you get $250,000 credit line to go buy a house. That $250,000 credit line, go buy a house. You can buy that house in all cash. You would have to buy it in all cash, $250,000, and you still have you didn't sell any crypto to get a $250,000 house, right? And that's great. And the lender, Milo or others, would be fine, because now you've collateralized your crypto. So even if your crypto goes to zero, they still have your house, right? So they feel very safe lending you money, because they've got your crypto gated. And so if it drops in value, they can sell your crypto to cover their debts with your permission, or you have to sell the house. But you're doubly protected as a borrower as well. You could sell your house to keep your crypto, or you can let them sell their crypto if it goes sideways. But if it goes up to $3 million, it's still yours. You've only given them access to $500,000 worth to kind of get started. So that's how the crypto-backed mortgages work. It's going to be interesting, and I bet there's going to be a lot of competitive products out there. And I'm excited to see if that disrupts the mortgage industry. I feel like it's not going to be instant disruption. It'll probably, not a whole lot of people have a ton of crypto assets and Bitcoin assets that they can even lend against. But if you're worried about taking money out of stocks and out of your checking and savings account to put it in crypto, this may be a safety blanket, right? That says, hey, let's spread out our investments like the rich people do, and then let's borrow it against it when the time comes. And if that $500,000 Bitcoin goes up to $1 million and you've borrowed 250, and you put that $250,000 not into a house but into stocks, and those stocks went to zero, no harm done. Your Bitcoin doubled in value, went up, right? But chances are that $250,000 you probably made 5-10 percent on it, and you've doubled, tripled your wealth. And then you take that new investment, pull out 70% of it, reinvest that somewhere else. Buy, borrow, and die. Hopefully you're not dying soon, but things to consider about long-term investing. Thanks for listening to the House of AC. Please hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, guys.